In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Graphene API Gateway and just trying to get a basic understanding of how the Graphene API Gateway is structured and how it works. And just as a recap, the Graphene API Gateway is a tool for building RESTful APIs that talk to any number of different kinds of resources, be them databases or anything else that we might want to talk to. So we're starting off here with a relatively blank slate. We've got our Graphene API Gateway. And the first thing that we're going to want to do when we stand up a new instance of the Graphene API Gateway is to build out an environment. Now, environments are kind of like containers that allow us to map our APIs that I'll talk about in a second to a particular URL. So in this particular situation, I've got apidev.example.com. That's the URL that we're specifically listening on. And you'll notice that every single environment that we have either is of a type dev or test or prod. And this is kind of a way of managing your DevOps stuff so that you have dev APIs, test APIs, and production APIs, and there's not any crosstalk between those things. That's going to be a common theme among other things that we look at within the API Gateway, where we have this notion of dev, test, and prod, and separation of types between those kinds of things. So I've got a single environment here, my dev environment. I also have a production environment as well, apiprod.example.com. In a real world situation, you might have maybe a couple different dev environments or a test environment in there as well. But for right now, we're just going to do two environments with two URLs, API dev and API prod. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to build out users inside of each one of those environments. Now, when I say users, I don't mean users in the traditional sense. These are not people. These are more like application keys, credentials that allow an external application to talk to our individual APIs. And as you'll notice here, users are specifically tied to a particular environment and inherit that type of environment. So if a environment is a dev environment, a user obviously would have to be a dev user as well. Same with production being a production user. So users 1 through 3 are all dev users in the dev environment, and user 4 is a production user in the production environment. And there's no crosstalk between those two. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to start instantiating resources. And resources can be databases, they can be secrets, they can be any number of different types of things, but they live outside of the environments themselves. Although you'll notice that they also carry with them that tag of whether they're dev or test or prod. So when we instantiate an API, and I'll do that in a second, we can only map development resources in a development environment. So we can't say that in the production environment that we're going to use a dev resource or vice versa. We want to make sure that we're always mapping the correct resource for the correct type of environment. So here we've got two banner resources, one dev, one prod, and two Blackboard resources, one dev, one prod. And these both happen to be database type resources. Okay, so let's put this stuff together. Now we're going to actually start building out an API. So we're going to build out a generic banner API, and it's going to have a bunch of different routes that do a whole bunch of different things, maybe get user information, get course schedule, get all of that kind of stuff. And that would all be defined between your routes and your code within the API. But the last thing at the bottom here is that we've got this notion of required resources. Because as you'll note, APIs are existing, again, outside of the environment and away from the resources. So when we write an API, we're telling we define within the API a list of resources that we would want to use. So for example, for the banner API, we might say we need to use a banner database. Now, we're not specifically telling it at this point which banner database we're using. We haven't told it if it's a dev or a prod database or a test database. We're just saying we need a banner database. So the next step that what we're going to do, once we've written our API, is we're going to want to instantiate that. And this is where we tie everything together. So we go back to our dev environment, our apidev.example.com environment, and we instantiate a banner API. So we instantiate an instance of the API we created previously. And this is where we map everything together. So under required resources before, we said that we require a banner database. So then we have the ability to look at our resources and say, okay, yep, here's a banner database. It's a dev database. That's what we're going to map to this particular API. Similarly, we need to map users or credentials to our particular API, and we can actually do that on a per route basis, and there's a whole bunch of granular control in there where we can say specific users only have access to specific routes for specific environments. But for this particular case, we're effectively just asserting that user 1, which is a dev user, has access to all of the API routes for the dev banner API instance. And of course, in a production environment, we could do the same thing. We could actually instantiate a Banner API in our production environment. But in that case, of course, we would not be able to use user 1 because that's a dev user. We would have to use maybe user 4 because that's a production user. And we would use the BannerDB production database as opposed to the BannerDB development database. So, but instead of doing that, I'm actually going to instantiate a Blackboard API. So this is the same type of situation, except in this particular one, instead of doing something in dev, we're actually doing everything in production. So we are using that user for that production user. We are using that production Blackboard database, and we're using the API that we've just built out. So hopefully this makes sense. It's kind of a basic way of abstracting away users and APIs and resources, and doing so in a way which is reasonably granular and doesn't allow for a whole lot of crosstalk between dev, test, and production environments. Also, something that I didn't mention before, but it's actually very important, is that when we have an API, we can actually have multiple versions of the API. And so it would be very common, for example, to say that we're running a particular version of an API in a production environment, and then we're iterating on a different version of that same API in a development environment. And you can do that side by side without clobbering the other, just by saying, locking a particular version to one instance and letting the other version maybe float to the latest version that's currently being worked on. And so there's a lot of granular controls within the API gateway that allow us to very easily develop APIs with a large team of people, with a lot of different resources, and manage our DevOps workflows so that we're not causing problems when we move from the dev to test to production. All right, that's all.